Good evening. Thanks for coming out tonight. It's really a wonderful day to be giving a forum on finances and tuition in light of what's going on in the stock market. Having just experienced the largest single-day point decline in stock market history. So great timing. I was also just talking to Laura, and she reminded, how many of you were here when Rudy Jordan was the dean? Anyone? So she told me about a story when Rudy was the dean, and he showed up to a presentation and was feeling unprepared, so he faked passing out on stage, so he didn't have to carry on. So we're not going to do that.
Not yet.
True story, right, Laura?
That's right.
What's the topic?
But so I wanted to just say a little bit about the precipitating nature of this event. So last year when we announced the tuition increase, we didn't fully contextualize that in relation to questions that parents asked subsequent to the release of the tuition memo. And so folks were really interested in learning more about the financial relationship between the School for Children and Bank Street College of Education as a whole, as well as trying to understand the value proposition of your tuition dollars. And so last year, being my first year, I took that feedback really seriously, and I wanted to thank Raj Malhotra and Justin Tyak and Renee Gregg, who have been working really hard over the last several months to prepare this presentation as a complement to the tuition memo and the contracts that were posted last week. So Raj is going to be leading us, as some of you know, Raj is the Director of Strategy, Finance, and Operations for Children's Programs, and he's going to be leading us through an analysis of the cost structure for the School for Children in relation to the college, and then I'll come back to speak about the revenue model as well as the benefits of a Bank Street education. So I'm going to ask that you hold off on your questions until the end because it's a very content-rich presentation and we promise to allow ample time for you to ask any questions that feel relevant, and we will do our best to answer them. So again, thanks for coming tonight, and I'm going to I want to start by just saying, as a preview, some of the key takeaways of this presentation, and again, these are responsive to questions that folks have been asking in various settings over the course of the last year. But on average, tuition revenue in the School for Children covers 92% of our costs. And so in order to run a balanced budget, the school is compelled to raise an additional $3,900 per child to cover our costs. We spent time methodologically looking at peer school comparisons, independent standalone schools, and Raj will speak a lot about this. But what we found is that by being part of a cost-sharing model with the college, where we are sharing the facility and other overhead costs, that our model saves us up to $1.5 million annually. And these savings allow for a very teacher-rich model, where we have, as you know, many teachers, qualified teachers in classrooms ranging from our youngest learners all the way through the upper school, as well as we are among the most diverse independent schools in the city of New York. And then lastly, there are non-financial benefits to being part of the college as a whole, including being part of a world-class teaching institution. We are, as you know, a laboratory for teacher training, and so we have the benefit of professors in the graduate school who are providing clinical supervision to our student teachers and our assistant teachers. There's a shared pedagogy and set of beliefs that undergird how we think about instruction and curriculum. We'll talk about this later, but we have a world-class library, and there are ample adult learning opportunities that abound in the school as part of our relationship to the college. So those are some key takeaways as we go in, and I'm going to turn things over to Raj to speak about the cost structure.
Thank you and good evening. Can you all hear me well? Awesome. So I'm going to start off with the overall costs of the institution. And just to let you know, these are the costs that are associated specifically to the School for Children. So they don't include ancillary or optional programs such as after school, summer camp, and the lunch program. So to begin, overall, every year our operating budget is about $23 million for the School for Children. If you look at that split up into our three major buckets, personnel, programmatic costs, and shared costs, and I'll go into each of these individually. Personnel is about 45% of our overall costs. So what's in personnel is our faculty, our staff, both full-time and part-time, as well as benefits related to those faculty and staff. It also includes some costs such as stipends and out of load. That would be for if we bring in substitute teachers and things like that as well. Second are programmatic costs, and so what falls in this bucket are things like field trips, books and materials, financial aid is in this bucket as well. If we bring in consultants for professional development, they fall within programmatic costs, and then any types of food or beverage that may be related to classrooms or any other materials directly related to the instructional expense of our classrooms. And then lastly, our shared costs, and you may think of these as things such as overhead, so they include our facilities, maintenance, and interest and depreciation that falls within that facilities bucket. It also includes our development office, information technology, and the business office as well as among other things too. And so if we look at this overall $23 million cost structure on a per student basis, we have 454 students right now. That comes out to be almost $51,000 per student, which is driving that initial number that Jen shared and one of the key takeaways. We'll get further into how that compares to our actual tuition and other non-tuition revenue. If we want to dig deeper into just the overhead costs, this is something that's quite unique to Bank Street because we are within a larger institution. Overall at Bank Street, not just the School for Children, but Bank Street as a college, we spend about $16.3 million on these shared costs. And so out of that, we're $7 million, which is about 43% of the overall pie of shared costs at Bank Street College of Education. If we want to look at that more proportionally in terms of how that is distributed just for School for Children, out of that $7 million, over 50% is going toward facilities. So this is the cost of our facility staff, maintenance, depreciation, interest, so that's over $3.5 million just towards that. The remaining is split up based on different methodologies because you can imagine that our interaction with the development office will be very different than our interaction with information technology or the library. So each of those pieces of the pie actually use a different methodology to calculate them. So to give you a couple of examples, the facilities half is based off of our utilization, both in space and time. The library is based off of how many users actually are students that actually go to the library out of the total amount of users. Things like general institution are related to our proportion of overall direct instructional costs. So each of these have their own methodology in terms of how we're calculating them based out of the $7 million figure. And the key question here is, how does this $7 million, which is roughly 30% of our operating budget, how does that compare to other independent standalone schools? Because that's the big difference between Bank Street and other institutions that are out there that are similar to us in terms of what they teach. And so we did this to kind of build out this model. We talked to peer schools, and to figure out what peer schools to talk to, we based it on 3 different variables. So one, what is the enrollment of this peer school? Are they similar to us? And in the 3 peer schools we did speak to, they're all similar, about 350 to 500 students for each of the schools. Second, what are the grades that they serve? Are they K through 8 like us? Because that can also affect your staffing. And then third, what is your approach to education? Is your pedagogy similar to us or not? And so all the schools that we did interview, they were all progressive schools. And so what we're doing is when we talk to these schools, we want to learn more about their staffing models, because if we're going to compare our overhead costs to other schools, there's 2 different big buckets that we need to compare. First are the variable costs, right? So what does staffing look like? What does general institution look like? General institution, just for those that aren't familiar with that term, is really fees. So what are our legal fees like, consulting fees like, processing fees? So that falls under the general institution bucket. Also some software falls under that as well. And then also what is the carrying cost of having a library, because that, as of right now, is general overhead. And then second are these fixed costs. So when I talk about fixed costs, it's primarily the building. And there's different ways to think about this. So you can think about a building cost as being, if we were to move to another location, how much would it cost to run that building? We roughly spend, I think we utilize about 96,000 square feet in this building right now. And the going rate in the Upper West Side within the vicinity of Bank Street is about $100 a square foot for rental. So that's about $9.6 million if we were to move and go somewhere else. And that's much higher than what our shared costs are, $7 million. So I didn't use that in this analysis because it doesn't seem like a fair comparison, because we wouldn't go at the current rental market rates. But what I did use in this analysis was what is the carrying cost of this specific building if we were just to use 96,000 square feet, which is about 80% of this entire building. What are the costs associated with that? And so that's the number that I'm going to be using in this model. So when we take all that into account and the conversations that we had with other schools to build out what their organizational structure looks within these buckets of staffing, so business office, information technology, their development office, and then there's this database called Dazzle, which is this online database that most schools submit salary information, financial information, enrollment information to derive essentially what the breakdown is of different average salaries for different positions. If we use that with the conversations that we had with these peer schools, we were able to build out at least general numbers in terms of how much each of these categories cost. So if we were to look at the variable costs, that overhead staff and related to those salaries in the organizational structure is about $2.4 million. The general institution cost is about $700,000. And so again, that relates to the fees as well as software that would go into that bucket. And this was actually cross-referenced with the phone calls that we had with the 3 peer schools. And then lastly, the library, which is similar to our current carrying cost of the library of about $400,000. And so in total, the variable costs are about $3.5 million. If we move to the fixed cost side, if we base it just off of the percentage of this building use and square footage terms, then it comes out to be about $2.3 million for facilities, 1.9 for depreciation, an additional $400,000 for interest. And so we take the sum of both the fixed costs and the variable costs, it's about $8.1 million overall for what our cost would be for overhead related expenses if we were a standalone school. So that $8.1 million, you would compare that to the $7 million that we currently pay as shared costs for the entire institution, or for Bank Street School for Children. But if you have any analysis, it's really good to add some type of margin of error, because there are going to be small calculation errors as you build your way up from a bottom-up approach of building out the staffing. And so I've added a 5% margin of error on both of these sides. So if $8.1 million is the number calculated, adding 5% on top of that brings us to $8.5 million, and taking down 5% is about $7.7 million. So now if you're comparing that range of $7.7 million to $8.5 million with the $7 million that we spend right now in terms of shared costs, the School for Children is saving about $700,000 to $1.5 million in these overhead costs as being part of the larger institution. And you may ask, where are those savings going? And there are 2 big buckets that they're going to. One is our teacher model, which is actually differentiated from many of the peer schools that teach similarly to us in terms of their pedagogy. And then 2 is we're allowed to have a more diverse student and parent body because we have these savings to push into other things such as financial aid. And now I'll go into the revenue side of things. So when we think about revenue, the major driver of revenue for any school is tuition. Every year we go about this analysis of understanding what our tuition should be the following year. And as you can imagine, no one's posting their rates for us to look at in advance. So we actually have to go out there and see what have the tuition rates been in the past 2 years to understand what the growth rates are. And we use that analysis to understand and situate ourselves within the larger market in our peer schools. And so this list in front of you, these schools were decided based on 3 factors. So first is, and if they fulfill any one of these three factors, they're on the list. Some may fulfill more of them. So the first is the school in the Upper West Side? Not all these schools in the Upper West Side, but some of them will be. 2, is it a K through 8 school? And then 3, is there some type of educational pedagogy that's similar to ours in terms of how they're being taught? So those are the 3 factors that are used to build this list. And so if any one of those factors are fulfilled, they're on this list here. If you look at the markets for both the 5-6s and the 13-14s, you realize that the overall market has gone up by about 4.5% in terms of tuition rates. And so Bank Street, this is a lagging indicator, by the way, so Bank Street for 17-18 similarly went up about 4.5%. I'm going to pass it on to Jed to bring the conversation forward.
So then the question becomes, in addition to the analysis of our peer set, why 5%? And so we wanted to give you a sense of annually what the increase in cost is to run the school. And you can see that about 4% annually is the increase in salaries and benefits. Justin and his team did a brilliant job this year negotiating it down to 10% from a much higher initial projection. And then about 7% in programmatic costs. And of course, facilities increases are variable depending upon the work that we're doing. And it's been as high as 30% and as stable as closer to 3%. But you can see that in order to accommodate for the increasing cost of running our school, we also need to keep up in terms of tuition. And even with this, there's still a gap between what we are charging and the total cost of educating a child at the school. So I want to acknowledge here that over about a 10-year span, there has been fluctuating increases in tuition. So back in 2008, 2009, there was a 9.25% increase in tuition. But since then, we've fluctuated sort of between 4.5%, 5.5% over the last several years. What you'll see is the tuition rates for next year. We did do a course adjustment for the 3s, 4s program, both for the half day and the full day, in order to be more competitive with the market sector. We did a lot of analysis of standalone preschools and what the cost of early childhood education is, and we realized that unlike the slide that Raj showed earlier, that we were way at the top of the chart in terms of our pre-K tuition for the 3s. And so we've made an adjustment for next year. And then you can see that there is a differential between our costs for the lower school and middle school, and then there's an increase in tuition for the upper school, which was done several years ago, basically to incorporate the cost of the overnight field trips into the upper school tuition. So we're talking about averages throughout this presentation, but we also acknowledge that the upper school tuition is higher than the other 2 divisions. So just looking over a 3-year view, what you can see is that our average tuition over the last 3 years, and you can also see the increasing enrollment over that time, is that we've basically gone up about $2,000, a little more than $2,000 a year for each of the last couple of years. So on the revenue side, in addition to tuition, in order to bridge that gap between the cost of educating a child and what we receive in tuition revenue, there's 2 places that we go. One is annual fundraising revenue. And you can see that based on FY17, Bank Street, in terms of this peer set, which are schools that we could access their data on Dazzle, as well as schools that appeared in the peer set that Raj mentioned earlier, that we have the lowest annual fundraising revenue of these 6 schools on this list. And I want to acknowledge those of you who have already contributed this year to the annual fund, and thank you for your contributions to date. We know that this is a priority for the school. We're still trying to establish a more robust culture of philanthropy. It's not just because we're going through the motions, but it's because we actually need that support to bridge the gap between what we charge for tuition and what it actually costs to educate children at Bank Street. So you'll see that we are on the lowest end of the scale for fundraising revenue, and then the next slide speaks to endowment revenue. And up until a few years ago, the School for Children didn't really have its own endowment, but for those of you who were involved in the campaign that Alexis led, we are seeing a yield from that, and in terms of annual per student revenue, it's about $800, $786 a year. So together, when you combine our fundraising revenue plus our endowment revenue, we're still significantly on the low end of the scale. And you can see that about $2,000 for FY17, so not the current school year, but the school year that ended on June 30th of 2017, that we, in addition to tuition, were able to capture an additional $2,000 per student in endowment and fundraising revenue. So this slide actually now shifts to the current school year based on projections. Obviously these aren't finished numbers because we're still in process, but as I said at the outset, our tuition covers about 92% of the total cost, and so we need to raise an additional $3.9K per kid through other means. And so those two means are the endowment and fundraising. And you can see that we're expecting to receive about $881 per pupil on the endowment side, and we have a tall task, which is to capture the additional revenue through fundraising, just north of $3,000 per kid. And again, I just want to name that we know that the delta between tuition and the total cost is lower for the upper school, but the upper school tuition includes those overnight field trips. So what does all this mean? What are you getting for your dollar? What's the value proposition of a Bank Street education? Now hopefully you can feel it just in being a member of the community and coming here every day, but we wanted to highlight a few of the salient factors. So when you look at our teaching model, not only are we part of a teacher education institution that is world-renowned, but we also are invested in lowering the adult-to-child ratio in the classroom. And so in our lower school, what you see is that we have approximately 20 students, and this is starting in kindergarten. Obviously, the class sizes are lower in the nursery program, but we have at least 3 adults in the room in our lower school classrooms. There's a head teacher, there's an associate teacher who is a graduate student training in the methodologies of the graduate school, and then we also have oftentimes a student teacher and always a midday teacher who comes for 4 hours during the day to provide additional support for the classroom. In grades 1 through 4, the middle school grades, similarly we have about a 20-to-2 ratio with a head teacher and an assistant teacher in every classroom. And the place where we really distinguish ourselves in terms of our teacher-rich models in the upper school, where because of the way that we have constructed the schedule in teaching and learning, we have 2 full-time teachers in every homeroom of approximately 20 students. And so we have a humanities teacher alongside a math science teacher, and in the math science arena, what that allows for is a really rich co-teaching model where both math teachers teach together, as well as teaching science in half groups. And then when you look at this across the 3 other peer schools that we were able to mine for their data, you can see that we by far have the most impressive student-to-teacher ratios of all of the 4. So again, we believe that Bank Street is the gold standard in teacher quality for New York City independent schools. About 2/3 of our teachers have been trained in our very own graduate school, and whereas other schools, I'm sure that when you were perusing the independent school market, oftentimes we hear that other schools speak in their open houses about the number of their teachers who have been trained at Bank Street and Teachers College. Well, we are Bank Street, and so we have our pick of the litter, and we're really excited to be able to create a pipeline of incredibly talented educators who come through our system who have also been trained in the pedagogy of our school. So they really hit the ground running. We also did an analysis through Dazzle where on average Bank Street teachers have 3 more years of teaching experience than those in our peer set. And obviously when we have more experienced teachers, that allows for transfer of knowledge across many generations and really to deepen our curriculum and instruction without lots of turnover. And then I mentioned this earlier, but it warrants repeating. We do have a clinical model where all of our student teachers are working with professors in the graduate school who come in and observe their teaching and provide clinical supervision and feedback, both one-on-one, but also through the advisory group model, where they're learning with cohort mates around the practices in their field. And we also have the ability to tap into graduate faculty when we are sharing questions and interests. So another major benefit in addition to our teacher-rich model is that we're really proud at Bank Street, and this is in concert with the college strategic plan that was authored about 4 years ago, to be among the most diverse independent schools in the city. And so I just want to say that because of the way that we allocate our resources, we are able to provide access to more children and more families than we would be able to do otherwise. So in terms of the scholarship rate, on the left side you'll see 2 different ways of slicing our socioeconomic diversity. If you take our total tuition dollars, basically with our allocation of financial aid, we're receiving 78 cents on the dollar. So, and that's given the whole population of full-paying students as well as those receiving financial aid. And then you can also see, and that compares to 15% in our peer set. And then you can also see that we have a significantly higher percentage of students who receive financial aid at Bank Street, 37%, as compared to 24% in other schools in the city. And then if you wanted to zoom in a little bit more, the range of actual awards that we give in our financial aid process is as low as 10% of the tuition, so, you know, $5,000 award, all the way up to 99% of the tuition, which would be more like a $49,500 award. The median award is $28.1K, and this is for families that receive financial aid, and the median income of that group of people is $155,000. So I don't want to conflate socioeconomic diversity with racial diversity. I think sometimes we make that mistake. But we also wanted to highlight that in terms of our racial diversity, Bank Street is at the top of our peer set in terms of the percentage of our students who identify as students of color. So 48% of our students self-designate in that way. Their families do. So other benefits of our model, you know, it's hard to follow Dolores Huerta in this auditorium, but I do want to say, and those of you that are here tonight know that this is true, that never a week goes by and rarely 2 days goes by where there's not an opportunity for adult members of our community to engage in really rich learning together. And so, you know, we are able, based on who we are and what we value, to bring in world-class speakers who embody the values and beliefs and teachings of our curriculum. And Dolores Huerta, for those of you who were here last week, is a shining example of that, where we had a true-to-life superhero in our midst. We also invite School for Children families to participate in the rich intellectual community of the broader college through library salons on Friday evenings, the annual Niemeyer Lecture. Last year, John Lewis was the commencement speaker, and many of our students and their families were able to participate in that. The Affinity Group program allows for parents to come together with people who share their lived experiences and want to learn together. And then as well, we have a monthly child development meeting. These are just a few examples of many where our psychologists hold court on issues that are relevant to parenting in the 21st century. And then in terms of the library and the Center for Children's Literature, these are unique benefits of Bank Street. It's the largest collection of children's books at any independent school in the country. Our kids get to participate because of the fact that we award annual Children's Book Awards through the Center for Children's Literature, as well as our own in-house Irma Black and Cook Prize Awards. Our kids actually get to participate in the vetting of these awards, and then when the authors come to receive them, they spend time in our classrooms in residency with our children. And then we have other endowed residencies that allow for artists, poets, authors in residence to spend meaningful time in our classrooms with our kids. So that's a lot of information, and we are now going to go to questions and answers. We appreciate that you've held on tightly, and we're happy to open it up for any questions that you might have. Yeah, sure.
I noticed a lot of you taking pictures. We're going to put a video recording online so that you can review the presentation. But yeah, I just saw a bunch of people take pictures. Just wanted to let you know about that.
So maybe you could put up the slide that showed costs. I think on fixed cost, on the overhead costs, you broke it up into fixed and variable. You talked about benchmarking that total package. Do you go out and specifically benchmark the variable cost component of that, which I think amounts to about $7,000 per student?
Sorry, so you're saying...
So that 3.5. So put aside, because the 4.7, as you pointed out in your example,
Yep.
there's stuff like real estate in there, which you start making assumptions that it involves how you finance real estate, all that kind of fun stuff.
Yep.
Put that aside, and you look at variable costs, which is strict, that's primarily people putting aside the library.
Yeah.
Did you benchmark that number on an aggregate and on a per